Everyone, in this series we are learning about how to create the front-end WooCommerce application using Next.js in React and use WordPress for the backend. In the previous tutorial, you learned about how to display all the products onto the home page using the REST API. However, in this tutorial, we are going to learn how to integrate GraphQL when fetching the data from the database. Now, you must be wondering why GraphQL? I mean, why did we learn the REST API approach at the first place? Now, the point I'm trying to make over here is that we are not building a project for a client. This is a tutorial that is going to tell you what are the possibilities that are available, what all you can do. Now, it'll be up to you what approach you want to take. So if you want to stick to the REST API approach, you can definitely do that. But in a moment, it will be clear to you why would we use the GraphQL and how beneficial it's going to be. Now, the problem with REST API is that it has got predefined endpoints that returns the exact same answer, which you need to manipulate on the client side in your format. So which means it's going to give you the exact same data every time, and if you want any specific data, then you probably need to send multiple queries. However, GraphQL allows the client or consumers to declaratively specify the data it needs for each element. So attaching a GraphQL specification to a React component tells the exact requirement to the server. So instead of creating multiple endpoints like REST API, it just creates one endpoint, and then it just uses that to fetch any data that you want. And the best part about GraphQL is that it's the query language which is language independent, which means it can be used with any language and databases. Okay. Now this isn't a GraphQL tutorial, so I'm not going to go into the detail of it, but I think it was important for you to understand why we are now using GraphQL and not continuing with the REST API. There are many tutorials available for GraphQL, so just to give you a heads up, I won't be going into the detail of it. But yes, probably I will also make a GraphQL tutorial separately in case if you don't know it already. But prior knowledge of GraphQL is not required. It's pretty simple, it's pretty easy, and whatever you're going to need it for, that'll be covered in this tutorial. Okay, so let's begin. So what is the first thing we need to do? So earlier we had been fetching data with the REST API, but now we need to fetch the data with the GraphQL. Now luckily we do have plugins that are available that can help us expose the endpoints that we can use to get the data using GraphQL. So I'll tell you which are those. So there are three plugins we're going to use. These are WordPress plugins. The first one is the wp-GraphQL that exposes GraphQL for WordPress. The second one, so basically it provides all of the endpoints that we need. The second one is the GraphQL, wp-GraphQL. So basically it provides the GraphQL playground. If you already worked for it, you would understand that this is where you can do all your testing of the query to check what data you actually get. And then the third one is wp-GraphQL WooCommerce. So this basically adds the WooCommerce functionality to wp-GraphQL plugin. Otherwise, you just get your normal post categories and things like that. If you don't add this plugin, you don't get the benefit of the WooCommerce. Okay, so these are the three plugins that we need to install. If you go into the README of this Github, you'll be able to GitHub repo, you'll be able to go on to these plugins. Okay, and you can, it's created by Jason Bahl, and you've got many other contributions from many developers. It's one of the most happening projects, so you can feel free to contribute to it, and you can go through README to understand it better. But you can just download it from here, and once you download it, just change the name of the first go ahead and unzip whatever you download, and then just change the name to wp-GraphQL, and similarly do that for the other two plugins as well. Okay, and once you do that, So once you have, let's go to downloads. So once you have that here, all of these plugins, then all you have to do is just go to dashboard and just add new and just upload the plugin. Of course, I'm assuming that if you've reached this stage, you already know about how to upload plugins. I'm not going to get into details. I have already installed these 3 plugins, so I'm not going to spend time on that. But you can see that we have got the GraphQL, and GraphQL WooCommerce, all of these plugins already installed and activated. Great, awesome. Now this GraphQL, this one right here, it actually gives you this settings. So you can go in here and you can test your queries. Okay, you can check what queries are available. So you can see all of these endpoints are available for product as well. We have this. So all of these are available that you can use. Okay. Great, awesome. So we're going to get into it as to how we're going to use it, but for now, just so that you know that it exists, that we can test it here. Okay, great. So the next step we want to do is basically just update our client config. So I'm just going to go to my client config.js and just add the GraphQL URL over here. Earlier we only had the site URL, which was basically your front end URL, but now we just need to add the GraphQL URL. So you'll just write GraphQL URL and just put your WordPress site URL over here and then slash GraphQL. So this is where all your query will be available at, and then you can just import it where we need it. Okay, so that's the only setting that you need to do. And once that is done, then what we're going to do is we're going to install some of the packages. We are going to use Apollo as well with the GraphQL. So we're going to use Apollo client, which is basically a state management library for JavaScript application. And what it does is basically it helps you fetch the data and guides you with the required structure for your code in a predictable, declarative way. And it's consistent with all the modern best practices. So it's pretty useful for your front-end application when you want to use GraphQL with the front end, like React. Okay, so you can go through the documentation regarding more information about Apollo client, but that's what we're going to use for our project. So the next thing we're going to do is go onto our components directory, and we're going to create a JavaScript file. We'll name it as Apollo client.js. Okay. Now before we write any code, we just need to install the required packages. So what we're going to do is to npm install. The first we're going to install is, the first thing will be GraphQL, then GraphQL tag, okay, and then Apollo boost, Apollo cache in memory, which helps caching the requests, okay, and then Apollo link HTTP, and then React Apollo. Okay, so once you install all of these packages, then the next thing you need to do is import fetch from node fetch. Then you need to import Apollo client, Apollo client from Apollo boost. So to understand what each of these are, you can always go to the npm package on npm registry and check them out. So for example, Apollo boost is fastest, easiest way to get started with the Apollo client. It's a zero config way to start with the Apollo client, and it has the in-memory cache and HTTP link which come configured for you so that it can help you save time. Then this is used for caching, so you can see it's recommended cache implementation Apollo client. Then you have the Apollo link HTTP, which is the most common Apollo link. It's a system of modular components for GraphQL networking. So basically these are the things that you would need. So the next thing I'm going to do is basically just go ahead and so now we need to import in memory cache from Apollo cache in memory, and also import create HTTP link from Apollo link HTTP. And then we just need to import the client config because we're going to use that. So we can just say import config, client config from client config.js. Okay. And then what we need to do is just create a client. So client, so this will be instantiation of the object using new keyword. We'll just say Apollo client. So this is how you create it. And then we just need to put some options there. The first option is the link that we want to create. So we'll say create HTTP link. And then we're going to use URI. Okay, so if you go on to the Apollo documentation, you can see this is how you create the client, and it's saying that let's create client, Apollo client, and all we need to know is just the URL of the website with the /GraphQL attached to it. So we've already got that here into the client config, so we just need that GraphQL URL over here. But yes, we have the URI, and all I need is just client config.graphql URL. Okay. And then the next thing we need to do is basically just use a fetch here. Okay. And then just export this client. So we can use it whenever we are creating a query. Export default client. Okay, great. Now, since we have created the client, we also need to use the in-cache memory, right? So then we can just say comma, and then we'll say cache. So we use the cache. Okay, new in-memory cache function. That's it. Okay. So if we have a look, we can see that this is how it creates the cache. So cache is equal to new in-memory cache, and that's what we're doing over here. All right. Great. And if we are using the create HTTP link, then we just need to put the URI like this and then put the URL inside of it. All right. Now what we're going to do is we'll go to our index.js inside of the pages, which is basically nothing but our main page, the home page. Okay. And now what we're going to do is we'll go ahead and import client that we have just created inside of the Apollo client. So we're exporting this client. We're just going to import it here.